Imagine waking up and the first sound you hear is not an alarm but a whisper. A slave standing near the doorway, murmuring the name and rank of every visitor already waiting outside, so that by the time you open your eyes, you already know who deserves a smile and who deserves a sigh. Before you have even stood up, your day has already been organized for you by other people, for you, around you. That is roughly what it meant to wake up wealthy in the ancient world. It was not simply comfort. Comfort is easy. What ancient wealth actually bought was control over information, control over time, and an audience. Being rich in antiquity meant living inside a performance that never quite ended, supported by a vast invisible machinery of other human beings, and shadowed the entire time by the quiet understanding that all of it could vanish. Mornings for the wealthy across the ancient world were rarely private. They were administrative. In Rome, a senator did not simply wake up, he woke into a hierarchy. A household slave called a nomenclator, whose entire professional skill was memorizing faces and names, stood ready to whisper identities into his ear as visitors approached, because forgetting the name of a useful man was a social catastrophe a senator could not afford. Visitors themselves were sorted long before they reached the door. The closest friends and most useful allies were received quietly, privately, before the crowd outside even saw the doors open. Everyone else waited in the street, ranked by usefulness, hoping for 2 minutes of eye contact. A Roman household functioned like a court with no king, and the senator's only real job some mornings was to remain visibly important for several consecutive hours. In Egypt, a vizier's morning began with scribes, not servants. Reports arrived constantly: grain levels in regional storehouses, irrigation disputes, tax assessments, temple deliveries. The tomb inscriptions of high officials describe a job that sounds suspiciously like running a small government from a breakfast table, because that is essentially what it was. Egyptian wealth at the top was bureaucratic wealth. You were rich because the machinery of the state ran through your hands, and your morning was the moment the machinery switched on. Persian nobility operated under an entirely different morning logic, one built around proximity to the king. Men called the king's friends, an actual formal title in the Achaemenid court, lived their entire careers chasing physical closeness to the throne, because in a system without modern bureaucracy, standing near power was power. Greek writers who visited the Persian court were fascinated and a little horrified by the practice of prostration before superiors, a custom that struck egalitarian Athenian visitors as deeply strange. To a Persian noble, it was simply how the morning worked. You bowed to those above you, and far below, other men bowed to you. A wealthy Persian satrap, governing a distant province on the king's behalf, faced a slightly different morning problem. His wealth was real, his palace was genuine, and his power over his territory was nearly absolute. But every gift of land, every title, and every measure of authority technically belonged to the king and could be recalled without warning. A satrap's morning often began with diplomatic correspondence, designed to remind the distant court that he remained loyal, useful, and not remotely interested in declaring independence, a daily reassurance ritual conducted entirely through letters, because the alternative, being suspected of rebellion, tended to end badly for everyone involved. In Han China, elite mornings often opened not with the living, but with the dead. Wealthy households maintained ancestral shrines, and the first ritual obligation of the day for the head of a great family could be an offering before the ancestor tablets, a brief ceremony acknowledging that one's current wealth and position were understood as a debt owed to the previous generation, to be repaid through proper conduct and eventually passed forward. It is a strikingly different theory of inheritance from the Roman or Persian model. Your money was not fully yours. It was on loan from your ancestors, and your ancestors were always watching to see if you wasted it. Across every one of these systems, the underlying message was the same. If you were rich, your morning was not your own. It belonged to other people's expectations of You and managing those expectations was, in a very real sense, the actual job. Homes were where all of this performance became physical, built directly into walls and gardens and water. A wealthy Roman domus included a small household shrine called the Lararium, often near the entrance, where the family's protective spirits were honored daily with incense and small offerings. It sat near the tablinum, the master's private office, where business documents and family records were stored, and where a Roman patriarch conducted the genuinely unglamorous paperwork side of being important. Some of the largest Roman houses even featured early heated flooring, a system of hot air channeled beneath the floor through brick chambers, meaning a sufficiently wealthy Roman could walk barefoot across a heated marble floor in the middle of winter while most of the empire shivered. Heating your floor before plumbing existed in most of the world is the kind of detail that quietly explains an entire society's priorities. Egyptian elite villas, particularly at sites like Amarna, were designed around airflow as much as decoration. Tall vents called wind catchers funneled cooler breeze down into living spaces, an early form of passive air conditioning built entirely from architecture and wind patterns rather than mechanics. Private garden pools stocked with fish and lotus flowers doubled as both food source and decoration, and sycamore trees, planted deliberately within courtyard walls, carried religious symbolism tied to shade, shelter, and the goddess Hathor. An Egyptian noble's garden was simultaneously a status symbol, a working food system, and a small religious statement, which is an impressively efficient use of a courtyard. Assyrian kings took landscaping to genuinely absurd lengths. Sennacherib, ruling from Nineveh, is described in his own inscriptions as having built an enormous palace garden irrigated by an aqueduct system that some modern scholars now believe may be the true origin of the famous Hanging Gardens legend, rather than Babylon at all. The man literally engineered an aqueduct specifically to keep his personal garden alive in a region where water was a serious strategic resource, which tells you something about how far royal vanity was permitted to bend a kingdom's engineering priorities. And then there is Persia, which gave the world something more permanent than any single garden. The old Persian word pyridiaza meant a walled royal garden or hunting park, carefully irrigated, planted with imported trees and stocked with game. Through Greek and later through religious translation, that word eventually became the English word paradise. Somewhere underneath every modern image of paradise as a perfect garden is a literal Persian nobleman's private hunting estate, which is either deeply poetic or a little bit embarrassing for the concept of paradise, depending on your mood. Further east, the Mauryan court of Chandragupta, described in detail by the Greek ambassador Megasthenes, ran on a similarly theatrical relationship between architecture and power. Megasthenes described a palace complex of wooden pillars gilded with gold and decorated with silver birds and golden vines, surrounded by parks, fish ponds, and tame animals kept purely for royal pleasure. All of it guarded by a security apparatus so extensive that the king reportedly changed his sleeping quarters nightly out of fear of assassination. Wealth at that level of the Mauryan court brought astonishing comfort and simultaneously brought a level of paranoia that meant the king himself could not safely sleep in the same room twice in a row. Food across these societies was rarely just food. It was an argument about who you were. The Roman general Lucullus became so famous for the extravagance of his banquets that his name entered the language itself. A genuinely excessive feast came to be described as Lucullan, an adjective built entirely out of one man's dinner parties. Imagine being remembered by history primarily as an adjective for showing off with food. There are emperors with less linguistic legacy than that. Greek symposia ran on a different kind of theatre, organized around a chosen symposiarch whose job was to determine the exact ratio of water to wine poured into the shared mixing bowl, a decision taken with real seriousness because drinking unmixed wine was considered the mark of an uncivilized barbarian. As the evening progressed, guests would Pass a sprig of myrtle around the room, and whoever held it had to improvise a short verse called a scholion, a kind of spontaneous drinking poetry performance under mild social pressure and increasing amounts of wine. It is essentially ancient karaoke for men who also happen to run the navy. Egyptian banquet scenes from tomb paintings often show guests wearing small cones of perfumed fat balanced on top of their wigs, which slowly melted over the course of the evening, releasing scented oil down the hair and skin. Whether this was literal practice or an artistic convention representing fragrance is still debated by Egyptologists, but either way, the intended message survives clearly across 3,000 years. Wealth should be something you could smell. Persian royal feasts left even Greek visitors stunned. Herodotus, describing Persian dining customs, marveled that where a Greek might rise from a meal still hungry, the Persians piled course after course of side dishes onto the table until the main meat dishes almost seemed like an afterthought. A Persian noble dinner was an exercise in sheer abundance, less about any single dish and more about the sustained, almost exhausting impression of plenty that never appeared to run out. Spices traveled further than almost anything else on an elite Roman table, and that distance was the entire point. Black pepper, sourced from the southern coast of India and carried by sea and overland route through Arabian and Egyptian middlemen before ever reaching a Roman kitchen, became so embedded in elite cuisine that the historian Pliny complained, with visible irritation, about the enormous sums Rome spent each year importing it. A wealthy Roman host sprinkling pepper liberally over a dish was not simply seasoning food. He was casually demonstrating a supply chain that stretched halfway across the known world, one pinch at a time. Leisure in the ancient world was rarely passive, and for the wealthy it frequently doubled as a form of public branding. Wealthy Romans sometimes kept private menageries of exotic animals, lions, ostriches, even leopards, housed on their estates purely as living proof of reach and connections, since acquiring a lion in 1st century Rome required serious trade networks stretching into North Africa. Owning one was less about entertainment and more about silently announcing how far your influence extended. In Athens, the politician Alcibiades took elite competition to an almost reckless extreme by entering 7 separate chariot teams in a single Olympic Games, an entry so large that ancient sources record him taking 1st, 2nd, and 4th place essentially against himself. It was less a demonstration of athletic skill than a demonstration of how much disposable wealth one man could pour into a single afternoon of prestige, and ancient Athenians, never shy about gossip, talked about it for years. Egyptian elites filled their leisure hours with the board game Senet, a game so central to elite identity that fully decorated Senet boards were placed in royal tombs, including the tomb of Tutankhamun, intended to provide entertainment in the afterlife as much as in life. Apparently, even eternity needed something to do after dinner. Persian nobility hunted inside those same walled paradisos parks that gave us the word paradise, stocked deliberately with game animals for the noble's convenience, turning hunting from a survival activity into a curated, almost theatrical leisure pursuit performed inside an artificially perfect landscape built for that exact purpose. Romans of every class gambled, but wealthy Romans gambled with theatrical confidence, betting heavily on dice games and a knucklebone game called tali during long dinner parties, despite the fact that gambling for money was technically illegal outside of a narrow window during the festival of Saturnalia. Enforcement against the wealthy was, predictably, inconsistent. Excavated gaming boards and loaded dice, weighted intentionally to favor certain roles, suggest that at least some Roman elites treated the legal risk of gambling as considerably smaller than the social risk of losing gracefully. The body itself, across every one of these cultures, functioned as a kind of walking advertisement. Roman society regulated this so seriously that wearing a gold ring was, for a long stretch of the Republic, restricted by law to senators and certain ranks of citizen, an actual legal privilege known as the right of the gold ring. Jewelry was not simply decoration, it was a visible, sanctioned legal marker of where you stood, enforced with the same seriousness as tax law. Roman sumptuary laws went further still, periodically attempting to restrict how much gold women could wear or how elaborate a private dinner could be. Restrictions that provoked enough public anger that one such law was eventually repealed after Roman matrons reportedly staged a public protest in the Forum demanding their jewelry back. Egyptian elite linen, sometimes called royal linen, was woven so finely it became nearly transparent, a textile so labor-intensive to produce that simply wearing it functioned as a quiet boast about the hundreds of hours of skilled weaving behind a single garment. Wigs made from human hair, carefully curled and layered, were standard formal wear for both men and women of status, with natural hair often shaved beneath them for cleanliness, meaning elite Egyptian fashion was, in a very literal sense, built on someone else's hair as much as your own labor. Persian and Indian elites leaned heavily on imported luxury, sandalwood incense, pearls sourced from distant Gulf fisheries, dyes that had traveled enormous distances along trade routes before ever touching skin. Wealth on the body across these cultures was frequently a quiet map of how far your trade connections actually reached. Marriage among the ancient wealthy was rarely treated as a private romantic decision. It functioned much closer to a corporate merger conducted by people who happened to also live in the same house afterward. Roman elite marriage operated as a tool of political alliance, and divorce was strikingly easy by later standards, requiring little more than a clear statement of intent rather than a court proceeding. Wealthy women frequently moved through multiple marriages over a lifetime, each one timed to whatever political alliance currently mattered most to their family. Cicero's own daughter, Tullia, married 3 separate times, each marriage corresponding neatly to a shift in her father's political fortunes. A useful Roman marriage was understood as one of the few areas where a wealthy woman, while still legally constrained in many respects, retained real strategic influence over her own family's future. In Athens, marriage operated under tighter restriction. A dowry called the proia was provided by the bride's family, technically intended to revert to her or her family if the marriage ended, offering a thin layer of financial protection in an otherwise male-controlled system. Marriages were arranged by fathers, often between a bride barely past childhood and a groom considerably older, and the household itself, called the oikos, was the true economic unit being merged, not simply 2 individuals. Wealthy Athenian men frequently maintained separate intellectual and social companionship with educated courtesans known as hetairae, women such as Aspasia, who were permitted an education and a public voice that a citizen wife, however wealthy her family, generally was not. Egyptian marriage, by contrast, was a refreshingly unromantic legal document. There was no religious ceremony required, simply a written contract listing the property each party brought into the household, and Egyptian women held the unusual right, for the ancient world, to initiate divorce themselves and to retain personal property independently throughout the marriage. An Egyptian noblewoman's wealth was, in a meaningfully real legal sense, actually hers. In Babylon, marriage carried its own precise financial machinery. A bride price called the tirhatu was paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, formally recorded and regulated under the Code of Hammurabi, alongside detailed legal provisions covering what happened to a wife's dowry in the event of death, divorce, or her inability to bear children. The code even permitted a man to take a second wife under specific infertility circumstances while still requiring certain protections for the first. Ancient Babylonian marriage law read less like poetry and more like an actuarial table, which, in its own dry way, was its own form of wealth management. Here is something that tends to get lost in all the luxury. Underneath the marriages, the gardens, and the perfumed wigs sat a constant gnawing anxiety because ancient wealth was almost never secure. During the prescriptions of the late Roman Republic, lists of Wealthy citizens were openly posted in the forum, men formally declared enemies of the state, their property confiscated, and their lives forfeit to anyone willing to collect a bounty for killing them. Being rich during a proscription did not protect you. It made you a target with a price tag attached. Some of the wealthiest men in Rome spent those years not enjoying their fortunes but hiding from them. Egyptian elites built entire careers around protecting their wealth into death, and even that frequently failed. By the New Kingdom, tomb robbery had become such a serious organized problem that priests eventually gathered the mummies of multiple pharaohs, including several of history's most famous rulers, and secretly reburied them together in a single hidden cache to keep them safe from looters. That cache stayed lost for roughly 3,000 years until its rediscovery in the late 19th century. Even the most powerful kings in Egyptian history could not fully guarantee their own afterlife security, which says something fairly sobering about how much protection wealth could actually buy. In Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi formally permitted a free person to be pledged into temporary servitude against an unpaid debt, sometimes for a fixed term of a few years, sometimes involving the debtor's own children rather than the debtor himself. A bad harvest or a failed trade venture could, under entirely legal terms, convert a free merchant's family into temporary collateral. Wealth in ancient Babylon was never far removed from the threat of its own opposite. Carthaginian wealth floated on the same unforgiving sea that built it. Carthage grew rich almost entirely through maritime trade, and a Carthaginian merchant's entire fortune could be loaded onto a single ship bound across the Mediterranean. Storms, piracy, and simple navigational error sank ships regularly, and surviving trade agreements show merchants attempting early, informal versions of risk-sharing, splitting cargo across multiple vessels rather than risking everything in one hold. It did not always work. A man could be among the wealthiest traders in Carthage in the spring and have nothing at all to his name by autumn, depending entirely on which way the wind happened to blow that season. None of this performance, comfort, or anxious display was possible without an enormous human engine running quietly underneath it, and that engine was built almost entirely out of other people's forced labor. The Roman playwright Terence, one of the most celebrated comic writers in Latin literature, is recorded by ancient biographers as having been an enslaved man, brought to Rome from North Africa, whose evident talent led his enslaver to free him and support his education. Some of the wit and warmth still studied in Latin classrooms today was produced by a man who, for part of his life, was legally considered someone else's property. Cicero's personal secretary, a man named Tiro, was also enslaved and is widely credited with inventing a shorthand notation system used to record speeches and letters at speed. Fragments of that shorthand system, known centuries later as Tironian notes, continued to appear in European manuscripts well into the medieval period. An enslaved man's filing system quietly outlived the Roman Empire itself. In Athens, a man named Persian began life enslaved, working in a banking house, and through skill, trust, and eventual manumission, rose to become one of the wealthiest individuals in the city, running both a bank and a shield manufacturing business, referenced directly in surviving Athenian court speeches. Passion's story complicates any simple picture of ancient slavery, without softening the brutality most enslaved people actually experienced, because his outcome was the rare exception, not the rule. The scale of the trade behind these individual stories is easy to lose sight of. The island of Delos operated as one of the largest slave markets in the ancient Mediterranean, processing, by some ancient estimates, thousands of people in a single day during peak periods. Surviving bronze and iron slave collars from the Roman world carry inscriptions instructing whoever found a runaway to return them to a named master for a stated reward. A chilling kind of ancient lost and found notice welded permanently around a human neck. Behind every elegant Roman dinner party and every perfumed Egyptian banquet sat a trade in human beings conducted. with the same matter-of-fact commercial language used for grain or pottery. Egypt offers a genuinely important nuance here. Modern archaeological work at sites like Giza has increasingly supported the view that the Great Pyramids were built largely by conscripted, rotating crews of free Egyptian laborers, fed, housed in dedicated worker villages, and compensated in bread and beer, rather than by chattel slaves in the way later popular imagination assumed. It does not make the labor easy. It does make it a meaningfully different system from Roman chattel slavery, one closer to a national labor tax than to ownership of human beings as property. And the distinction matters for understanding how differently ancient societies organized the same basic problem of getting enormous amounts of work done. After all the performance, the food, the gardens, the fear, and the labor underneath it all, ancient wealth bought one final, almost abstract thing that may have mattered more than anything else. Romans built an entire philosophical vocabulary around it. The Latin word negotium, meaning business or work, was literally constructed from the negation of otium, meaning leisure. Business was defined, grammatically and culturally, as the absence of leisure, the deviation from the default valued state, rather than the other way around as most modern societies now assume. Cicero himself wrote longingly of otium cum dignitate, leisure pursued with dignity, as the proper goal of a respectable life once active public duties were complete. For the Roman elite, idleness was not a guilty failure to be productive. It was, at least in theory, the entire point of having succeeded in the first place. That is perhaps the strangest difference between their wealth and ours. Today, the assumption runs the opposite direction. Work is the default state of a life, and leisure is the rare scheduled exception carved briefly out of it, even for the wealthy. In antiquity, for those at the very top, it briefly worked the other way around. Work was the interruption. Leisure was the baseline they were owed. It came at an almost unimaginable human cost, propped up by forced and conscripted labor on a scale modern economies would never tolerate, shadowed constantly by the real possibility of sudden ruin, and performed every single day for an audience that never stopped watching. Marriages were arranged like treaties, gardens were engineered like military projects, and even a king's bedroom changed nightly out of fear. None of it resembled relaxation in any sense a modern person would recognize. It was closer to a permanent, exhausting performance of having already won, staged for an audience that was always slightly suspicious it might not be true. But for a narrow slice of people across these ancient civilizations, for a few centuries at a time, it briefly meant something close to this. You did not have to ask permission to stop moving. Everyone else around you still did. 2,000 years later, the gardens are gone, the perfumed cones have melted into dust, and the gold rings have been melted down a dozen times over into other things entirely. What survived, oddly enough, is the basic shape of the performance itself, the same hunger to be watched, to be served, to be visibly, undeniably exempt from the ordinary grind that everyone else is still required to endure. We just call it something else now.